Hello everyone, we are here in the last installment of our week on embroidered narratives, and we have been talking about the use of Zardozi and then how Zardozis are used in this way of writing and overwriting narratives. So here we'll just start with the discussion on how Zardozis are made, and in this one we find this particular kind of like this wooden bed frame as used for the base for this Zardozi making. So here we have an image of Aslam who's working on the Zardozi this frame, which is also called Adda, and in this bed frame the cloth on which like Zardozi will be made, that is tightly stretched, and then the images which would be embroidered, they are then like either printed from block or they are like transferred from like carbon and other kind of like tracing techniques onto the fabric, and then when required then extra pieces of fabric are then also added on the top of this one fabric. And here we can see, so for example, like there are those extra pieces of fabric, then those are added on the top of this fabric onto which like embroidery will be done, and then the embroider sort of sits there and pierces through the fabric surface and sort of like makes the embroidery, and on the way like whatever is extra required, so for example those precious or semi-precious stones, today a lot of like those plastic materials are used in Zardozi, so all those things are then like added on the top of this fabric and then like sort of embroidered by the sides and with it, so that is how like they are put together on the fabric. So this is a very different way of embroidering from kantha or like the rabari embroidery technique that we have seen so far, and there's a reason the kind of like effect it also creates is very different. And so for example in this image in the left side we find that how this a particular piece of fabric, that is we find that to be different from the background fabric, this pale greenish fabric that is then added here for making this panel, and then on the top of that this highly ornate peacock image is then created. And even in this imagery we can see that it's not just the gold or like the metal wrapped thread or zari that is used, but also like the additional material. So for example, as I have already mentioned, that precious or semi precious material, they are also then added with it. That is the reason it sort of creates this low relief kind of presence. So for example, the figures which are created or like all the motifs which are created, they do not really stay on the same level with the surface, but they are always projected out of the surface, so it gives this three-dimensional quality to them, something we find in the Zardozi fabric as a prime characteristic feature of the Zardozi fabric. So Zardozi is something we find that to be reserved either for the royalty or for like special occasions as marriage and so on. So those are definitely not something we find them to be used by people for a day-to-day basis, but they are only reserved for very special occasions or coronation ceremony and so on. So from Zardozi, if we move towards the other forms of embroidery making, we find that applique is something that is usually added to these techniques. And by applique I mean that adding extra pieces of fabric. So something we have already seen in the earlier installments of this week, in which like in Ahmedabad and part of Gujarat, how like pieces of fabric, like those cut pieces of fabric, are added to the already existing fabric surface. Even in Zardozi we have seen in the earlier example that we have already looked at in the earlier slide, that how pieces of fabric are then added on the layer of the existing fabric and then it is stitched or embroidered with the other material. So similarly, applique is something that we have seen to be there in use for various different purposes in the Indian subcontinent. So if we think about like applique, that is also there in the quilting technique, in which like small pieces of used fabric, they are put together and then stitched together for making a quilt. Then there are also very specific kind of textiles we have seen them there. So for example, this one textile that we have on screen is this long large temple hanging that is there. It is embroidered and at the same time appliqued, and it shows scene from Ramayana, and at the center stage we have image of the coronation of Rama, and then we also have like in the this vertical panels which are around them, they have like the other Vaishnava images in the sides, and then there are those continuous narrative panels in the upper border and in the lower border of this image, in which we see that the narratives from Ramayana, they are depicted there. So this is something we see that, I mean, if we consider it, that is happening in this particular fabric, that the fabric was perhaps dyed in indigo, and then, like, I mean, of course, like, and then pieces were added, like, I mean, small pieces were added, like, I mean, the fabric pieces were added for making this particular decorations here, like the diamond shaped pieces, we can see them to be there in this fabric. And then also, like, I mean, part of the borders are also then added with, like, I mean, other colors. So those things we can see that how embroidery and applique, in both cases, that how pieces of fabric and then yarn, those two things are added to an existing surface, is something that comes up prominently, is there in this particular kind of fabric making. And in this one, what we see that this particular kind of fabric is something that comes somewhere between making wearables like a sari or dhoti, and then, like, I mean, also making murals. So for example, that since this is a temple hanging, one can imagine that this kind of hangings will not just be there in the temples, but would probably be projected at a time of a performance, perhaps a night-long performance, in which, like, the episodes of Ramayana are sort of played out or depicted, and then during this time this kind of hangings would be spread, or, like, I mean, would be put up on the wall. And so this kind of, like, I mean, purposes the temple hangings would serve, something we have already considered in terms of, like, kalamkari hangings. And in this case, against a dark background, against this dark indigo background, the images are executed with white or undyed threads, mostly with white and undyed threads, but also, like, I mean, pale yellow, and sometimes red is also used for making this embroidery. So this extensively embroidered fabric piece, we see that, I mean, there are certain kind of compositional formats. So for example, this image on the right side of the screen, in which we see that coronation of Rama is there, and in this one we see that the Rama's figure is shown in the frontal position, whereas the other images are there in the profile, something we have already seen in the Kalamkari temple hangings. And then we also see this kind of imagery in the temple murals when we were comparing the temple murals with kalamkari hangings, and we can extend that to this particular embroidered fabric as well. So this fabric was perhaps made in the Nayaka period in the 18th century, sometime in the 18th century, and we can consider it to be there in part of southern India, perhaps in Tamil Nadu. And this case, what we see that, I mean, there is again this close correlation between mural making and this temple hanging making. However, if we go back to the first image, we see that there is a clear border on two sides of this fabric. It almost sort of reminds us of the wearables, in which there are clear borders, or pallu and so on, those are there in the sides of the fabric, and then there is also those running borders which sort of, like, I mean, run lengthwise in the fabric, and then the images are created in the center of it. So in that case, we can see that, I mean, how this kind of fabric, they sort of stay between the wearable fabric, like if something that is wrapped around the body, and then the temple murals. And it is none of them. It is not a temple mural, it is not really a wearable fabric, but the format, the compositional arrangement, and then, like, the overall qualities of this textile, that sort of make us think that it is somewhere in between, and none of those usual utilitarian purposes are served by this kind of fabric. The other form of applique textile that we find that to be there is this kanduri cloth, and kanduri cloth, or the shrine flag that we see it there, and that is made in part of Uttar Pradesh, that used to be made part in Uttar Pradesh, and that is near the Baharech. And in Baharech there is this a particular occasion in which commemoration of the death of a 19-year-old saint, Islamic saint, Ghazi Mia, is celebrated, and in a particular time in the year when his death is commemorated, during that time we find this applique shrine flags are created. And these applique flags, in which we find that there are already, like, I mean, this shape is like a flag or a alam, and then on the top of that, like, I mean, various pieces of fabric, then they are added to make those figurative narrations. And then we see that the applique flag is also attached to this piece of fabric which would like cover the bamboo pole which would be inserted into this area, and that is how like this flags will be carried by the devotees in the procession, which is sort of like taken out during this occasion. So in terms of the devotees, we see that both Hindus and Muslims, they participate in commemorating this saint's death, and Ghazi is a particular word that is used for the warrior saints. And in this case we see that Ghazi Mia, this 11th century saint, was there, who was considered to have fought for rights, and at the age of 19, and it was the last battle in which he died. And so like certain scenes from the last battle and then the other imagery which are associated with them are then sort of like projected on the top of this prayer flags. And these flags are something, then those are after fulfillment of the wishes, we see them to be there auctioned, and then like the money from there, those are used for the particular shrine in Bahraich. So this description of it comes up in Rosemary Krill's exploration of this kanduri cloth or the shrine flag. So some of this flags are there in part of the collection of Victoria Albert Museum, but also we find them to be there dispersed in some of the other museum collection, as Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver and so on. So in this case, what we see that again this applique technique is used for writing a story, and then we see that what kind of like specific information they have. So for example, here in this case we see that there is a body that is bleeding, and this bleeding body is shown by like first by applying this one white piece of fabric to show the body, and on the top of that like this extra red piece of fabric that is added on the top of it for showing the blood on the body. And then we see that how this body has fallen here, and again like the blood that is sort of draining out of the body is created by using this other two strips of red fabric. So this is how like we can see that it is not just depicting a story, but like there is again this idea of overlapping elements and with the help of this kind of overlapping, certain kind of like imagery are created, certain kind of narratives are then developed. So those things we find them to be there in this particular way of making this applique fabric. So with that we again sort of like go back to this idea about how embroidery is related to making and sort of like writing and overwriting narratives. The other form of like this appliqued fabric we find, and those are there which are predominantly used by the temples in Tamil Nadu, and those would be the applique fabric which are used in the temples, but also like predominantly during the chariot processions. And so during the chariot festivals, what we find them to be there, that in this large wooden chariots which are exclusively made or like sort of like developed during this chariot festivals, in which the gods, the presiding gods and goddesses of the temples, they would be taken in procession around the neighborhood, and that is how like the people would be able to like see the gods who are not visiting the temple, but also it's a way of like to mark the territory of those temple premises. So and a practice in which we find that certain kind of embroidered applique textiles are used for decorating the chariot, but I'd not just say that those are used for decorating them, but also there are other purposes which this kind of textiles they serve. So we find there are those cloth pillars. So for example, this cylindrical pillars, those are created by this applique and embroidered fabrics. Those are there, this cloth pillars which are called tombai, and then there are also those arches. Those arches, they also sort of remind us of the temple gateways, and of course like we can see this how this arches, they might also have like influence of the sultanates and the Mughal architecture. So those arches are, which are also called vasamalai, and those are their part of like the decoration of for these chariots. And then we also have the toranam, or like this the torana that is there not just in this particular case, but also we find that the toranams are there in Rabari embroidery and so on. So in all these cases, what we see how the textile made the cloth pillars, or the arches or the toranams are something that remind us of the architectural elements in a temple. And when there is a requirement for the gods to travel outside of the temple, and then when there is a requirement for a temporary structure and not a permanent structure, then why textile is required in that case and not really a permanent stone pillar is required. So those kind of things we can see how those are context dependent, and then why particular kind of this embroidered and applique textiles are used in these cases. Now making applique and also adding embroidery, or adding dyed images with them is something we have seen in this part of the country, in the Tanjavur Kumbakonam region, and then also in the Madurai region for at least for last 2-3 centuries and so on. So this is something that certainly requires much more research into it, that why applique and not any other crafting technique that is involved in it. But perhaps one can also see that what applique does with it in terms of giving stability to this cloth pillars, and also adding different kind of colors and flavors and everything else, which would otherwise be much more difficult to achieve in perhaps in dyed fabric making or woven fabric making. So these things also raises the concern about the use of workmanship, domesticity and textiles, because once we consider that what is here in this form of textile making, we see that in a lot of times that embroidery is something that is usually been considered in a lot of recent scholarship to be relegated towards to the household members. So for example, if we think about it, that how kantha is created, how Rabari embroidery is created, a lot of times it is the women in the house who would be making this embroidery. But with that, can we consider that embroidery to be a craft that is mastered by women, or can we consider that embroidery is synonymous with domesticity? Can we consider that embroidery is something that is synonymous with a particular gender and nothing else? Now in these cases, I believe that we need to be much more sort of flexible in terms of when we define particular techniques, because one needs to understand also that how this particular techniques have been there in with the human civilization for centuries, for millennia, and perhaps framing certain kind of ideologies, or seeing those techniques through a lens of a gender or a particular concept is something that can be one way of looking at it, but that cannot really define the entire technique. So for example, if we go back to talk about this particular form of embroidery that is there, the Tombai, the Vasamalai and Toranam, those are made for this temple chariots in Madurai and also part of Tamil Nadu. So this is something we can see that these are made in a workshop setting where both men and women work. It's not really something that is exclusively made by either men or women. And then we can also see that there are particular workshops which would be involved in making this kind of the cloth pillars and the other decorations. It is not something that is associated with the domestic work. Now if we think about it, that how this cloth toranams are used in the Rabari context, then before it was highly marketized and then sort of made into an overseas commodity, we have found that how the Rabari toranams were something those are made by the women members in the community. So then we can see that if it is about making toranam, so for the temple toranam, we find that to have a very different kind of setup for the workshops, workshop members and for the artisans, whereas in the Rabari setting, we find that to be very drastically different. And of course, we understand that the purpose for which these are created and the kind of the utilitarian purpose they serve are also very different in these two cases. But in both cases, we need to understand that how applique and embroidery are used. So the technique is something that perhaps transcend certain kind of the framing devices. We can think about that, what kind of workmanship we can see, what kind of ideas about gender, those are related to them, we can see it there. But then the use of applique, the use of embroidery is something that definitely transcend certain of these boundaries, and that's the reason there is a requirement for all of us to sort of see beyond particular framing devices. When it comes to talk about the domesticity, domesticity is something we can consider that it is also something that is related to, again, the role of women in making textiles. But certain kind of examples, so for example, if we think about how the Rabaris, if we go with Judy Fretter's argument that how the Rabaris may have also learned the embroidery technique from the Mochi community, then we cannot really justify that how today, if we think about the Rabari embroidery to be associated only with the domestic members and with domesticity, and then with women, then learning from the Mochi community or whatever the kind of exchanges they had from with the Mochi community cannot really completely satisfy that this is something that needs to be only relegated to the concept of domesticity and not the workshop space. So there is always this kind of tension and overlapping between something we understand in terms of private and public, and those things we also see them to be there very much contextual in terms of what is created, for what purpose they are created. So for example, if we come back to this temple cloths, and if we think about them, that why this kind of embroidered and appliqued fabrics are used in decorating the temple chariot, it is also about visibility, and it is also about making things possible perhaps within a given point in time, which might not be possible in the other forms of textile making, like brocading, and also perhaps making them through this complex process of kalamkari dyeing. So these are some of the aspects we need to understand, that when we consider workmanship, domesticity, textiles, all these concepts together, so we need to understand that the technique can be a bridge between all these different concepts. However, we cannot really define technique by only one lens, but we need to be open enough to accommodate as many as interpretations as possible. So with that, we come to the conclusion of this week, and in this one, if we think about it, that what all different kind of aspects we have studied in terms of making of embroidered fabrics and the embroidered narratives. One of the things that perhaps comes up again and again, and that is about writing and overwriting narratives, and that is also something we understand as a palimpsest. And palimpsest, by that we mean that if there are certain kind of narratives which are written and then overwriting on the top of it, or perhaps removing certain parts of it and then adding on the top of it. Sometimes it is about erasal, and also at the same time how overlapping, adding layers to it is something that is encouraged. So this palimpsest, in this idea, something we have already seen perhaps in the making of various kinds of manuscripts, in which the manuscripts in the early modern period in the Mughal court and in the other courts, we see how images were created, then text were added on the top of it, or text was there but then images were added on the top of it. Then after a century or so, the borders were also added. So those kind of acts in which we see that there is already a tendency towards reworking is something that has been exemplified in the making of embroidered fabrics, and in which we can see that when there are particular kind of embroidered fabrics which are created. So for example, if we go back to the reference or the example of Kantha, in which we see that the used fabric, used yarn, or the used threads, all of them, they already carry certain narratives, they already carry certain kind of significances, then they are sort of overlapped with each other, and by doing that we see that there is a particular kind of overwriting or writing narratives and then layering that sort of takes place one after another. So all these things, they become possible only by the technique of this addition. At the same time, if we think about like the kind of writing and overwriting narratives that happens in the shrine flags, or like the other kind of appliqué fabric, we see that how there are stories which have been there in the mind or in the oral narratives of people, and then with different kind of like colors which are then like which carry particular narratives in either in the specific religious context or in the regional context or in the cultural context, then they are sort of used in this playful way for depicting a story in the most effective way possible. So with that, what happens, we see that there is again this overlapping, overwriting of the stories. They sort of like continuously take place. So this idea of the palimpsest, in which we see that how addition of a narrative, perhaps sometimes an intentional or an unintentional removal of a narrative, all these things simultaneously take place in the making and unmaking of the embroidered fabrics. So embroidered and appliqué fabric, in both cases we find, as I have already mentioned in the early part of this week, that there is already a constructed surface that sort of like gives us the base upon which the narratives will play out, very similar to the act of writing and painting perhaps. So in this case, what happens that with addition of this additional pieces of fabric, or like these embroidered lines, so with that, what happens, we see that there is the narrative sort of progresses further, something we see with like the making and unmaking of a written narrative or perhaps a painted narrative. So in those respects, we see that there are much similarities in writing, drawing and making embroidery. But we also need to consider that the technique of doing embroidery and applique and this idea of the addition is something that is distinctive. So there are both like similarities and dissimilarities between like this shared visual practices. Thank you.